I've been thinking about whether to tell this story for a long time. My daughter keeps saying I should. She says people need to hear it. Maybe she's right. Maybe it's enough that I remember it, that I was there, and that I watched a man who believed his own name was more valuable than his word lose everything he'd spent 40 years building. And I had a front row seat. My name doesn't matter much to this story. What matters is that I'm 63 years old. I grew up in Akron, Ohio, the son of a tool-and-die machinist who worked the same shift at the same plant for 31 years, and I have never once in my life believed that a man's worth could be measured by the cut of his suit or the floor his office sat on. My father taught me that. He'd come home with grease under his fingernails, and he'd sit at the dinner table and say grace like he meant every word of it. That's the kind of man I tried to be. I spent most of my career in commercial real estate. Not the glamorous kind you see on television, not glass towers in Manhattan or resort developments in Florida. I worked in the unglamorous middle of it, industrial parks, distribution centers, the kind of properties that make a city actually function, warehouses in Columbus, a logistics hub outside of Cincinnati, a cold storage facility near Toledo that I negotiated for 11 months before the deal closed. Nobody writes magazine profiles about that kind of work, but it's real and it matters, and over 30-some years, I built something quiet and substantial and mine. I also built a family. My wife passed 11 years ago. Breast cancer, quick and cruel, the way it sometimes is. And after that it was just me and my daughter, and later her husband, and then my grandson, who is 5 years old and thinks I hung the moon, which is the greatest privilege of my entire life. My daughter married a good man. His name is Connor, and he works in logistics management, and he treats her well, and he loves that boy fiercely, and I have never had a single complaint. But Connor's father, that's a different story. That's the story. His name is Whitfield Barrett. I want you to hold that name for a moment, because by the time I'm done, I think you'll understand why I remember it so clearly. Whitfield Barrett was the founder and chairman of Barrett Capital Partners, a private equity firm based in Chicago that at its peak managed somewhere north of $4 billion in assets. He was the kind of man who had his name on buildings. Not just figuratively. I mean literally, there were buildings with his name on them. He wore bespoke suits and drove a black Cadillac Escalade with a driver. And when he walked into a room, people stood up a little straighter, and I think he believed that was his natural right. We met for the first time at Connor and my daughter's engagement party. It was a Saturday evening at a restaurant in the River North neighborhood of Chicago. A nice place, linen tablecloths, the kind of lighting that makes everyone look a little better than they are. I drove up from Akron in my truck, a 2018 F-150. Nothing fancy, because I don't fly for anything under 4 hours. I walked in wearing my good sport coat and the Rockport dress shoes I've had since 2014 because they still look fine and they still fit, and I'm not going to throw out a pair of shoes that still fit. Whitfield Barrett was already there when I arrived, holding a glass of something amber and expensive, surrounded by 3 or 4 people who were laughing at something he'd just said. He was a big man, maybe 6'2", silver-haired, in the way that reads as distinguished when you have money, with a jaw like something carved out of granite and eyes that did that thing. You know the thing, where they look at you and look through you at the same time. My daughter brought me over and introduced us. She was nervous, I could tell. She had a say of touching her earring when she was nervous, and she was touching her earring. "Dad," she said, "this is Connor's father, Whitfield Barrett." I put out my hand. I said it was nice to meet him. He looked at my hand. Then he looked at me. Then he looked back at his drink and said, calmly, pleasantly, as if he were commenting on the weather, "I've heard you're in real estate." "Industrial, mostly," I said. My hand was still out. He didn't take it. He said, "Interesting," in a tone that made it clear he did not find it interesting at all. Then he turned back to his group, and the conversation he'd been having resumed as if I'd never walked up. I stood there for maybe 2 full seconds with my hand out. 2 seconds is a long time when everyone around you just watched something happen. I put my hand back in my pocket. I smiled at my daughter, who looked like she wanted to dissolve into the floor. I said, "It's a nice place, sweetheart," and I excused myself to find the bar. I did not make a scene. I am not a scene-making man, but I filed it away the way I file everything away. I have always been good at remembering what people show me. The wedding was 8 months later. Outdoor ceremony in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, late August, the kind of evening that makes you believe in something. My daughter was breathtaking. Connor cried when he saw her, which sealed my approval of him completely and permanently. I sat in the front row on her side, and I held it together until the vows, and then I didn't hold it together, and I'm not ashamed of that. The reception was at a hotel on the lake. Whitfield Barrett gave a toast that was, I'll be honest, mostly about Whitfield Barrett, how he'd raised Connor, how he'd built his firm, how family legacy was everything to him. Connor looked mildly uncomfortable. My daughter kept her smile on. I drank my champagne and nodded at the appropriate moments. At one point during the reception, Whitfield found me at my table. He sat down across from me, which surprised me, and he said, "So, Akron," as if the city itself explained something about me that he'd already decided. "Born and raised," I said, "and you've done industrial properties your whole career." 32 years, I said. He nodded slowly, the way someone nods when they're being polite but thinking about something else. "Small market," he said, "regional stuff." "It's added up," I said. He smiled. The smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm sure it has," he said, and then someone called his name from across the room, and he excused himself, and that was our longest conversation for the next 4 years. Here's something I didn't tell Whitfield Barrett that night, or any night after. I didn't tell him because he didn't ask, and because he'd already decided who I was before he looked at my shoes. 22 years ago, I started putting money aside, not in stocks, not in mutual funds. I don't like things I can't touch. I put it into properties. Quietly, I bought parcels of land in and around the Columbus metro area when they were worth very little, because I could see what was coming. The distribution boom, the e-commerce wave, the need for last-mile logistics infrastructure within 30 miles of every major city. I wasn't guessing. I was reading. I subscribed to 3 different trade journals, and I drove out to look at every parcel myself before I bought it. And I waited, sometimes for years, for the right moment to develop or sell. By the time of my daughter's wedding, I had an interest in 11 properties, clear title on 4, and a stake in a private REIT that I'd helped structure with 2 partners out of Columbus. The total value, conservatively appraised, was something in the neighborhood of $60 million. I don't say this to brag. I say it because it is relevant to what happened next. About 2 years after the wedding, Connor called me on a Sunday afternoon. He sounded careful, the way people sound when they're choosing their words. He said his father's firm was going through a restructuring. Some of their larger commercial real estate holdings, distribution centers, industrial parks, a few logistics facilities, were underperforming, and they were looking at a significant write-down if they couldn't find a way to reposition the assets or bring in a capital partner who understood that sector. "He's not doing well, Dad," Connor said, and I could tell by the way he said Dad that he was asking me something without quite asking it. I said, "Tell me about the assets." Connor sent me a summary document that evening. I read it twice. Then I called one of my partners in Columbus, a man named Terence Bow, who had been with me for 19 years and who has the sharpest mind for distressed industrial assets I've ever encountered, and I said, "Take a look at this." Terence called me back the next morning. He said, "These are salvageable. 3 of them are actually good. The rest are mediocre but fixable with the right repositioning." I said, "That's what I thought." The question was whether I wanted to put capital into a situation connected to Whitfield Barrett. I thought about it for a week. I thought about my daughter, who was happy. I thought about Connor, who was a good man in a complicated position. I thought about my grandson, who was not yet born but who I already knew was coming, because my daughter had told me 2 weeks earlier, just me, just the 2 of us on a phone call, where she cried happy tears, and I held the phone and looked out the window at my backyard and thought about my wife and how much she would have loved this. I decided to help, not for Whitfield, for the people who depended on the situation being resolved, for Connor, for my daughter, for the workers in those facilities whose jobs were tied to whether those properties stayed operational. That's the honest reason. I reached out through Terence, not directly. I kept my name off the initial inquiry. We structured the approach as an acquisition interest from an unnamed capital partner, because I know how deals work, and I know that the moment a seller knows exactly who wants what they have, they behave differently. We came in clean and quiet and professional. The negotiations took about 4 months. Terence handled most of the direct contact. We brought in a third partner, a woman named Sylvia Park out of Cleveland, who specializes in turnaround financing for industrial assets, and the three of us structured an offer that gave Barrett Capital a genuine exit from their worst positions while retaining equity in the 3 properties with real upside. It was a fair deal. It was more than fair. It was the kind of deal that saved a situation that, by all rights, should have been a complete loss. The closing was scheduled for a Tuesday in March, at the offices of Barrett Capital's attorneys in Chicago. I drove up the night before. I got a room at a Hampton Inn off the interstate because I don't see the point in spending $300 for a hotel room when I'm only going to sleep in it. I want to tell you about that morning. I want to tell you because the details matter. I wore a charcoal grey suit I've had for 6 years. Good suit, well made, from a shop in Columbus that's been there since the 1970s. I wore a blue tie my daughter gave me for Father's Day 2 years before, and my Rockport shoes, which I had polished the night before with a kit I carry in my bag. Terence met me in the lobby of the law firm. It was a corner office building on LaSalle Street, 30-something floors, the kind of place where the receptionist is trained to make you feel like an appointment, not a person. We took the elevator up and were shown to a conference room with a view of the Chicago skyline and a long mahogany table and a coffee service that nobody was touching. Whitfield Barrett came in about 10 minutes after we sat down. He had 2 attorneys and a man I recognized as his CFO. He looked older than the last time I'd seen him, at Christmas 2 years before, where he'd shaken Connor's hand and nodded at me from across the room. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. The suit was still impeccable. The posture was still the posture of a man his toxis Terence. He shook hands with Terence. He shook hands with Sylvia. He glanced at me with something between recognition and confusion, because I had not been introduced in any of the prior communications as anything other than a silent partner, and my presence in the room did not yet compute. Then one of his attorneys said, "Mr. Barrett, I believe you may know Mr." And she said my name. I watched his face. I've replayed that moment a lot. I've tried to be accurate about it, tried not to add drama that wasn't there. But what I saw was this. His jaw tightened. His eyes went to me, then to the documents on the table, then back to me. A calculation was happening behind those eyes, fast and unhappy. He said, "I didn't realize you were involved in this." I said, "I'm the capital partner." There was a silence. Terence was looking at his folder. Sylvia was looking at the skyline. The attorneys on both sides were very carefully not looking at anything in particular. Whitfield said, "I see." I said, "Should we get started?" He said, "Of course," and sat down. We got through the first 40 minutes of the closing without incident. There was a lot of paper, a lot of initialing, the kind of procedural rhythm that lawyers keep up because it leaves no room for anything else. I signed where I was told to sign. I asked 2 questions, both of which were answered by his attorneys in a way that suggested they were tired of the same questions. Everything was moving forward. And then we took a break. Coffee refills, bathroom breaks, the CFO, stepping out to take a call. Whitfield and I ended up on the same side of the room near the windows, with about 6 feet of space between us. He looked at me for a moment, then he said quietly, not cruelly, but with a kind of flat certainty that was maybe worse than cruelty, "You know, I've always thought Connor made an interesting choice." I didn't say anything. "She's a lovely girl," he said. "Your daughter." "But this world," he gestured vaguely at the room, the skyline, something. "It's not the world she grew up in." I held his gaze. "No hard feelings," he said. "I just think it's worth being honest. You've done well with what you had. That's admirable. But this," he gestured again, "this is a different level. I said very quietly. Whitfield, I'm about to wire $14.3 million into an escrow account to complete this purchase. I think you might want to finish the paperwork before you say anything else. He looked at me. I held his gaze for another 3 seconds. Then I walked back to my chair. We finished the closing. Every document was signed. The escrow was funded. Hands were shaken. Terence's, Sylvia's, the attorneys. Whitfield Barrett shook my hand at the end, a brief dry grip, and said, "Good doing business," and left the room without looking back. I sat in that conference room for a moment after everyone else had filed out. Just me and the mahogany table and the Chicago skyline and the remnants of a coffee service. I thought about my father coming home with grease on his hands. I thought about the first parcel I ever bought, a gravel lot in a flood plain outside of Zanesville that everyone told me was worthless. I thought about my wife, who used to say that the quiet ones are always the ones worth watching. Then I drove back to Akron. What happened after that took about 14 months to fully unfold, though the seeds of it were planted long before I ever walked into that conference room. Barrett Capital Partners had other problems that had nothing to do with me. Their exposure to a portfolio of suburban office buildings, the kind of half-empty corporate campuses that had been dying slowly since 2020, was significant. Their flagship fund had been underperforming its benchmark for 3 consecutive years. There were 2 limited partners who had been quietly making noise about the management fees, and at least 1 institutional investor who had hired an outside consultant to review the firm's asset valuations. I know all of this because Connor told me, in pieces, over Sunday dinners and phone calls, in the way that adult children sometimes process their complicated feelings about their parents by talking to their other parents. He didn't ask me to do anything. He wasn't asking me to get involved. He was just talking the way people talk when something big is happening and they need to say it out loud to someone they trust. I listened. I didn't offer advice. I didn't insert myself. I just listened. The story that came out over those months went something like this. Barrett Capital had used the real estate repositioning, our deal, to buy themselves about 18 months of runway with their limited partners. But the office portfolio problem didn't go away. If anything, it accelerated. Hybrid work was not a trend that reversed. Vacancy rates in their suburban office holdings stayed above 40%. The math stopped working. In the fall, there was a board meeting. I wasn't there. I wasn't a board member. So it was simply a counterparty on one completed transaction. But Connor was in the building that day, there for a separate meeting with the firm's operations team, and he told me afterward what the hallways felt like. He said it felt like a hospital the day before something bad happens. Quiet in the wrong way. The board voted to begin winding down 2 of the firm's 3 funds. The office portfolio would be sold in tranches at a significant loss. The total write-down, once it was all calculated, came to somewhere between $2 and $3 billion in assets under management. Not all of it liquid. Not all of it gone in the simplest sense, but gone in the sense that matters. The value that had existed on paper, the wealth that people had trusted the firm to steward, significantly and in many cases permanently reduced. Whitfield Barrett stepped down as chairman 4 months later. The announcement was a press release. I read it on a Tuesday morning over coffee that used the phrase planned transition approximately 4 times and cited his desire to spend more time with his family, which I found darkly ironic. I didn't call anyone when I read it. I didn't post anything. I didn't send a note to Connor, who I knew was having his own complicated feelings about all of it. I just folded my newspaper. I still read an actual newspaper, the Columbus Dispatch, because some habits are load-bearing, and I refilled my coffee, and I looked out the kitchen window at the yard, where my grandson likes to chase the dog, and I thought, that's how it goes. My daughter called me that afternoon. She said, "Did you see?" I said, "I saw." There was a quiet moment. Then she said, "Are you okay?" Which surprised me. I said, "Why wouldn't I be okay?" She said, "Because he was awful to you, for years, and I never said enough about it, and I should have." I said, "Sweetheart." She said, "No, I mean it." That night at the engagement party, "I remember," I said, "and the wedding, and Christmas, and the way he talked about Akron, about your work, like it was." "I know," I said. And you never said anything. You never reacted. I thought about how to answer that. I thought about it for a moment. There wasn't anything to say, I told her. He was who he was. That was always going to work itself out. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Connor asked me what you're like. When we first started dating, I told him you were the most patient man I'd ever met. What did he say? He said he hoped he'd get to know you. I said, he's done all right. She laughed. It sounded like her mother. The last thing I'll say, because I think it's the part that actually matters, the part I want to get right, is this. A few months after the Barrett Capital announcement, Connor and I were at a high school basketball game together. My grandson was too young for the game itself, but Connor coaches a youth league, and one of his players had an older brother on the team, so we went to watch. It was a Friday night in January. The gym was warm and smelled like floor wax and concession stand nachos, and we sat in the bleachers and watched these kids play. In the fourth quarter, Connor said to me, without looking away from the court, he asked about you, you know. I said, who did? My father. Connor paused. A few weeks ago, he called me. He wanted to know. He said he'd been thinking about the closing, the one in Chicago. He said he realized he'd been rude to you. He wanted to know if he should reach out. I waited. I told him he should probably think about why he wanted to, Connor said. Whether it was because he was sorry or because, because of what happened to the firm. I said that was the right answer. Connor nodded. His team scored and the gym erupted for a moment and then settled back to its baseline noise. He said he didn't reach out. I said that's okay. And I meant it. I genuinely meant it. Because here is the thing about dignity. It's not something you prove once, in a conference room, when the numbers finally land in your favor. It's something you practice every day, in every room, whether anyone's watching or not. My father knew that. He knew it with grease on his hands and grace at the dinner table and 31 years of showing up. I know it too. And I think, on some level, Whitfield Barrett knows it now. That's enough for me.